Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something you hear a lot, this sort of anxiety that really permeates, galleries, museums, studios, everywhere, really. It's this deep, almost paralyzing fear that if art tries too hard, like to influence power or impact society or maybe achieve a concrete goal, it just stops being art. It collapses into, well, propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. That tension, it feels ancient, but also incredibly sharp right now, doesn't it?
Totally. Is creative work meant to be this detached, beautiful reflection? Or is it supposed to be active, maybe a tool for change? We're kind of circling around that famous idea, the one people argue about.
Oh, the art is not a mirror, but a hammer line.
That's the one. Whether it's Trotsky or Brecht or whoever actually said it first, is art a mirror or a hammer?
Right. And that quote, it's like the ghost in the machine for so many cultural institutions. There's this really powerful sort of lingering idea, especially in the high-end art world, that real artists have to stick purely to abstraction, aesthetics, form, beauty, escape even.
Uh-huh.
And the second you bring in like a focused political strategy aimed at something tangible, some real-world outcome, suddenly the work is tainted.
Contaminated.
Yeah, contaminated. The worry is pretty explicit. Mixing art and politics. That leads to bad art, or worse, cynical manipulation, propaganda.
Okay, so what the sources you shared are digging into is this idea that maybe this fear, this insistence on keeping art and activism separate, maybe it fundamentally misunderstands how influence actually works today, and that kind of inadvertently it ends up protecting the status quo.
Precisely. So we really need to unpack this concern, and that means asking a tough question. Who actually benefits most when artists and creators are, frankly, terrified of being called propagandists?
Right.
And, how can we maybe redefine both art and propaganda using more up-to-date communication models to see past this old fear? That's really the core of what we're getting into today.
Okay, great. Let's maybe start with the language itself, because I find this really interesting. We get so worked up about instrumentalizing art. But like you said, in almost every other situation, instrumental is, well, it's positive. We celebrate someone playing an instrumental role in a project's success, or we're relieved that surgery was instrumental in saving someone.
Absolutely. Good examples.
So why does it become this, dirty, scary word when we attach it to a painting or a protest banner?
Well, I think it's because the word instrumental, it sort of rips down this carefully built facade of neutrality that the big institutional art world really relies on.
How so?
Think about how art is usually shown off, right? The hushed quiet, the climate control, those pristine white walls in a gallery or museum.
The white cube.
Exactly, the white cube. These places are deliberately designed to isolate your perception, control the context. They want you to believe the art experience is somehow separate from the messy reality of power, money, class, society.
Okay, but hang on. Isn't that isolation sometimes helpful? Isn't part of a museum's job to, filter the chaos so we can actually focus on the piece itself, its form, color, history, without all the noise? That seems like a useful service.
Oh, it is a service, no doubt.
Yeah.
But the key thing is, it's never neutral. These institutions, just by the choices they make, what they buy, what they show, which histories they decide are important, who they let in the door, or how much they charge, they are always serving an instrumental purpose. Always. They're didactic. They teach us things implicitly about class, about value, about who gets remembered, and honestly, about who can even afford the luxury of just standing there looking detached.
Right.
They operate inside this huge global system of power, capital, influence. They're not neutral observers. They're active participants, active teachers.
And then if you step outside the museum into the actual fine art market, well, neutrality just seems like a joke, right?
Oh, completely.
That whole sector is purely instrumentalized. The
Right.
art world, fundamentally, it's a marketplace. Luxury goods, financial investments, even a kind of unregulated currency for the super rich.
Yeah.
I mean, when someone drops $100 million on a painting, they're not just thinking about aesthetics, surely. They're thinking about hedging bets, moving assets, consolidating status.
Absolutely spot on. Art is always instrumentalized, always. The only real question is to what end? Is it instrumental for one person's financial gain, or could it be instrumental for, say, collective liberation?
That puts a fine point on it. So if this whole ecosystem, especially high-end art, is already deeply instrumentalized, just mostly for profit and influence, why does this specific institutional fear of activism persist so strongly? Why the constant policing of that line between art and politics?
Well, because that separation elevating this idea of art done in isolation, detached from politics, it's incredibly profitable for some.
Sure.
The huge influence of the capitalist classes that drive the global art market, they benefit enormously from this belief that activism is separate, maybe even inferior or contaminating.
Right.
It's a convenient myth. It effectively declaws creative work that might actually challenge the system that benefits them. It stops it before it even starts sometimes. And maintaining that detachment, the idea that the serious artist has to stay politically vague or purely abstract, that takes constant work, constant tending, funding, labor. We're talking billions spent over decades on endowments, fancy buildings, lobbying academic departments, all to preserve that artificial split between art and activism.
Wow.
It reminds me of something that Chicano artist and activist Malaquis Montoya said, something like, art has always been propaganda. It's just mostly been propaganda for the rich and powerful.
That really reframes it. It's not just about taste or purity. It's about protecting a system, an
Yeah,
economic modus.
exactly. Systemic protection.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We need to look at communication models because this whole fear of art turning into propaganda seems rooted in a pretty old-fashioned idea of how messages even work, like mid-20th century stuff.
Yeah, totally.
This old fear assumes that if a political message doesn't land exactly as the artist intended, then the communication just failed. Full
Yeah.
stop.
We're talking about what communication theorists used to call the Hypodermic Needle Model, or sometimes the magic bullet model. It comes straight out of those early Shannon Weaver ideas about signal transmission.
Okay.
In that model, the political message is the bullet, or the injection, perfectly encoded into the propaganda piece. And the belief was, once the viewer sees it, boom, that political thought gets immediately and perfectly decoded.
So successful propaganda, in that view, meant the creator literally imposed their exact thought onto the viewer, like a direct one-to-one injection of ideology.
Precisely, a giant ideological syringe. And that's what people are afraid activist art becomes. But the material we're looking at introduces a totally different way to think about it, one that feels much more accurate for art aimed at social change. It's the Duncombe and Lambert model of artistic activism. And here, the artwork isn't a needle. It functions like a prism.
A prism. Okay, that image clicks much better immediately. So the artist deliberately puts a mix of ideas, maybe goals, concepts, into the artwork, like a focused beam of light going into the prism.
Exactly. That's the intent, the focus beam. And when it enters the prism, what comes out the other side?
A spectrum.
A spectrum of meaning.
Yeah.
And those meanings can be complex. They might include serious calls to action, but also irony, maybe conflicting emotions, really nuanced perspectives. The artist provides the initial energy, the focus, but the light that radiates out is multifaceted.
And the crucial difference here is the viewer's role, right? The viewer has to engage with those layers, interpret them. They actually form a different mix of thoughts than maybe what the artist put in originally. In the old needle model, that difference meant failure. Why is it a success here?
Because it creates agency in the viewer.
Yeah.
It's not about imposing thought. It's about provoking thought. When the messages get sort of filtered and refined by the viewer, when they do the work of interpretation connected to their own lives, the message becomes much more personally meaningful. It sticks. And that personal connection, that's the real key to actually motivating action, creating agency, something the old 1930s propaganda model could never really achieve reliably or ethically.
Can you give us a quick example of this prism effect, something concrete?
Sure. Think back to that 2008 project, The Artistic Action, where activists handed out that special edition of the New York Times right after Obama's first election.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It looked real, but wasn't.
Exactly. Professionally printed, felt like the Times. But the headlines and stories were all like, best case scenario, utopian futures, end of the Iraq War, universal health care achieved, stuff like that. The point is, readers weren't actually deceived. The effectiveness came entirely from that transparency, the fact that it wasn't real, and the multiple layers of meaning.
So it worked because it wasn't a lie trying to trick people. It was this elaborate what if, this projection of possibility, and the reader had to actively engage with it, understanding the irony, the hope, the social critique all at once.
Yes, that's the opposite of cynical manipulation. It's an invitation to imagine.
Got it.
So artistic activism thrives when it creates that kind of dialogue, that personal investment. We can pretty confidently say that art trying to create change and dialogue doesn't automatically become that old school hypodermic needle. It just doesn't work that way.
Okay, all right. So here's where things get, well, really interesting. And the narrative takes a big turn. We've kind of established that art aiming to change the world isn't automatically becoming that old, scary 1930s propaganda. So artists should feel safer now, right?
You'd think so.
But the argument in this deep dive is that we should still worry about art becoming propaganda just for totally different reasons. Because propaganda itself has radically changed in the 21st century. That Hypodermic Needle Model, it's basically obsolete.
Absolutely. We've moved from an era that often sought, a single totalitarian position the old way into what people sometimes call the post-truth environment. It's different now. Well, think about contemporary politics, especially in the U.S. You see politicians just brazenly claiming alternative facts, right? Or making huge claims, like about election fraud, with zero evidence. The goal isn't always to convince everyone of one specific lie.
So what is the goal then, if not convincing?
Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon actually summed it up pretty bluntly, if crudely. He talked about flooding the zone with shit.
Right, I remember that quote.
The objective isn't necessarily to impose one single thought. It's to generate such a massive amount of noise, so much contradictory information, so much stuff, that the average person just gets overwhelmed, confused, and eventually maybe nihilistic.
And the example used to illustrate this toxic flood perfectly is the reaction from Russian state media after Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, MH17, was shot down over Ukraine back in 2014.
Yeah, the chillingly perfect case study. Instead of trying to push just one false story, what did they do? Russian state media strategically blasted out multiple, often contradictory, explanations across tons of channels, all at the same time.
So not just one lie, but many.
Many. They offered a whole spectrum of theories. Some sounded maybe plausible, but were wrong, like blaming Ukrainian jets. Others were just completely wild.
Yeah. Like what?
Oh, suggestions that Western powers shot it down trying to assassinate Putin, who's supposedly flying nearby. Or that the plane was secretly the missing Flight 370 filled with dead bodies already. Or, the Illuminatis were involved. Seriously, they didn't just push one story, they pushed a dozen competing realities.
Wow. And the actual truth, which the official joint investigation team, led by the Dutch, eventually found, proving it was Russian military-provided missiles that truth was reported.
Oh, yeah, it was reported.
Yeah.
But it got completely drowned out, lost in the flood.
Just another theory among many.
Exactly. The truth became just one more possibility floating in this overwhelming sea of noise. And polling later showed that very few Russian citizens actually believed the official JIT report. Not necessarily because they were convinced of a different specific lie, but because they felt like, well, who could possibly know the real truth? It all seemed unknowable. So they just shrugged, resigned themselves to uncertainty.
That's genuinely terrifying. That's the outcome of the flood strategy. Reality itself starts to feel less important. Truth becomes slippery, malleable, maybe unknowable, which leads ordinary people to feel overwhelmed, confused, apathetic. They just disengage. They stop even trying to find the truth because it feels pointless.
And who benefits most when the public just checks out like that?
Only the most powerful, the most corrupt.
Exactly. If citizens give up, those in power can operate with impunity. So the new propaganda isn't about forcing one thought on everyone. It's about destroying the possibility of coherent thought, of shared reality altogether.
Okay, so let's bring this back to art. Let's map that ambiguous political art onto this modern propaganda model. What happens if art is deliberately vague? If it raises questions but makes a point of not leading to concrete conclusions? Or if its only stated goal is just to start a conversation or raise awareness, where does that kind of art land in this information flood?
Well, according to this analysis, it lands squarely in the flood zone. Art that just sort of dabbles in political issues or offers only an ambiguous critique without a clear point of view or suggested action. It just adds another perspective, another possibility. More questions to the already overwhelming deluge.
That adds to the noise.
It adds to the noise, yeah.
But wait, isn't ambiguity sometimes necessary? To explore really complex issues, if art just gives us a simple, definitive answer, doesn't that risk becoming propaganda in the old sense?
It's a fair point, but it really depends on the artist's intention and strategy. The argument here is that artistic activism can be clarifying, motivating, even transformative, precisely when it uses focused intention. When it strategically connects the issues it raises to concrete outcomes, potential actions, when it helps people see actionable steps they could take, maybe right now. The truth isn't always self-evident, especially today. The truth needs help. It needs clarity, focus, maybe even direction to actually cut through all that noise.
Okay.
So the key realization, the pivot, is this. The real danger for artists today isn't so much that their work becomes the 1930s hypodermic needle, because achieving that kind of total mind control is actually really hard and pretty rare.
Right.
The real danger is that by presenting just another vague perspective, or simply adding more information into an already flooded zone without focused intent, without a clear pathway to action of their art, ends up functioning perfectly as modern propaganda. It inadvertently encourages more overwhelm, more confusion, more apathy.
Wow. Okay. That is the profound insight we were building towards. The danger isn't that art gets weaponized with one clear totalitarian message anymore. It's that vague, non-committal political art becomes just another drop in the 21st century flood, unintentionally pushing the audience towards feeling powerless, fatalistic, and disengaged.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean there's no place for creative freedom, for exploring aesthetics, for art that just inspires awe or contemplation. Of course there is. That's profoundly important, always will be.
Sure.
But the argument is, when artists do choose to engage with social and political issues, they need to recognize the immense power they hold and the responsibility that comes with it. They have a choice. Use that power to clarify, to motivate, to cut through the noise, or inadvertently add to the fog that ultimately benefits the powerful.
Which leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to chew on. If the art world's own powerful economic forces tend to pull towards detachment and ambiguity, and if modern propaganda works precisely by overwhelming us into nihilism, then what practical strategic actions actually define art that successfully cuts through that flood? Art that aims for concrete change, rather than just adding to the noise.
Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.